welcome everyone. I'm Maggie Onosorgan. I'm the Public Programs and Relations Manager here at the Ameren Museum. Thank you for joining us today for new insights into the old period in Casas Grandes, 10 years of Viejo period research in northern Mexico with Dr. Michael Searcy. Before we begin our program, I would like to acknowledge that the Ameren is located in southern Arizona on lands where the Otham, Oshwe, Yoeme, Hopi, and Apache families have lived for untold generations, and whose wisdom and traditions live on today in vibrant communities. We are grateful for what all of these communities, rich in history, have to teach us. We would also like to thank all our members and donors who enable the Ameren to provide this free online programming and fulfill Ameren's mission to foster and promote the knowledge and understanding of the Native peoples of the Americas through research, education, conservation, and community engagement. To learn how you can assist the Ameren in supporting its mission and programs by becoming a member or donor, please visit ameren.org. Please also join us on Saturday, May 13th at 11 a.m. for Dr. Elise Villalpando speaking on pre-Hispanic jewelry from the sea. She will focus on the ornamental use of shell among early agriculture communities of the Chihuahuan Desert. Please visit the events section of Ameren's Facebook page or website, ameren.org, for registration and details for these and any other upcoming events. If you would like to ask questions during this program today, type your questions in the Q&A chat box and we'll gather those and pass them on to Dr. Searcy at the end of the program. Also, a link to today's recording will be sent to all of you that registered. And now I'm pleased to introduce our speaker, Dr. Michael Searcy. He's an associate professor of anthropology and archaeology in the Department of Anthropology at Brigham Young University. He is currently serving as a department chair and director of the New World Archaeological Foundation. For over 15 years, he has worked in northern Mexico, researching Casas Grandes cultural traditions with a focus on the Viejo period, 700 to 1200 AD. Michael recently co-authored a book, Hinterlands to Cities, The Archaeology of Northwest Mexico with Matthew Pales. And his recent research includes an ancient DNA study, as well as a reanalysis of chronology in the Casas Grandes region. So please welcome Dr. Michael Searcy.
Thank you so much, Maggie. I appreciate not only your invitation to participate, but also the chance to kind of gather my thoughts about some of our most recent excavations. I feel like it's these presentations that really make me think a little bit more about, what we're doing as a whole, especially this program that's gone on for over 10 years of trying to figure out like what happened before one of the largest city centers in all of the US Southwest and Northwest Mexico was built. And this is prior to, not too long before a contact period when the Spanish came and began exploring these parts of not only northern Mexico, but what we call today northern Mexico, but also Southwest US. This is a desert region. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, by the way. I have plenty of pictures to show. So let me pull these up. And here we go. All right. I'm assuming everybody can see that. Does that look good, Maggie? Okay, she may not be able to hear me.
That looks great, yeah.
Great, excellent. Okay, so northern Mexico's, it's got two very, two of the largest desert ecological zones in North America, the Chihuahuan Desert and the Sonoran Desert. These conveniently kind of fall in both the states of Chihuahua and Sonora. Chihuahua is the largest state in Mexico. And it is, for the most part, desert region, home to a lot of ranching and different things like that. But it was also the home to a large and thriving indigenous culture. When we think about Mexico, when we think about the archaeology there, I think most people think of the great city of Teotihuacan in central Mexico, or Tula, or anybody who's been to Cancun or that region may have visited Tulum or the other Mayan sites with some northern Mexican influences like Chichen Itza. We think of Tikal in Guatemala, but not many people think or hear about what's going on in northern Mexico. And that a lot of that has to do with not only some of the recent cartel violence, and I would say also the amount of money that is actually put on the archaeology of northern Mexico, at least within the country of Mexico. But it's kind of like this hinterland. It's kind of like out there, which is actually great for me as an archaeologist, because it gives me the opportunity to work in an area to fill the gap where we don't know much about the prehistoric people of this region. I think just to give you a small comparison, and this is something that Matt Pales and I were looking at in kind of summarizing what's been done in the archaeology of this region up until the publishing of our book just last year. But there's around somewhere probably between 1,500 and 1,600 permitted archaeologists in the state of Arizona alone. And the largest state of Mexico, in Chihuahua, I think there's probably 5. So outside of those of us who come in and excavate, which really I think right now there's only 2 of us actively excavating in Chihuahua from outside of Mexico itself, there's not very many people digging in this region of the world. And so again, it presents not only some challenges, but it also presents like tons of opportunities for finding out things that we didn't know about this region. So my work has been in this region for over a little over 15 years. Since I started my PhD, when I started my PhD at the University of Oklahoma. This map shows the site of Paquime. When people in this area were first encountered by the Spanish, and they were asking the Spanish who came ask about this site, they called it Paquime, which is an indigenous word, but it's also known as Casas Grandes, which is a Spanish word for big houses. The reason for this is because they built a large city center with apartment buildings that were somewhere between 3 and 4 stories tall. But this just kind of gives you an idea of where the Casas Grandes people are located. We call this the Four Corners region, the International Four Corners region. So Arizona, New Mexico, Sonora, and Chihuahua. And the Casas Grandes people lived in this northwest portion of Chihuahua. The time periods that we have identified archaeologically, and for which we have really good or at least up to this point, we have some good chronological time periods, are the Medio period, which is the later period we know more about, again, when people started building the city of Casas Grandes, or Paquime, which grew, of course, outside of that city itself. There were sister cities and smaller, I would say definitely like power centers or centers of control close to that city center. But then there were populations all throughout the river valleys and northwest Chihuahua, excuse me, especially in these well-watered valleys like the Casas Grandes, the Santa Maria. There were others such as the Palanganas and many, many others. And so again, in the desert, you need water. And so people plopped their houses down pretty close to water. They were also a farming community or farming society. Farming mostly domesticated corn, but we also have evidence of beans and squash. And these, of course, as we understand it, probably arrived in this area from Mexico, southern Mexico, at one time in the past. And so what we knew a lot about was the Medio period, which is, and no offense to Charles de Peso, who was the original excavator and person to come up some of these time periods. It just means the middle period, which is sandwiched between the late period, the tardío period, and then the earlier period is called the Viejo period, which is the old period, hence the title of my talk today, New Insights into the Old Period. This was originally divided up into 3 kind of phases. Unfortunately, through recent research, we found that these phases don't make much sense. But originally, Charles de Peso suggested that you could identify these through different construction types, houses or pit houses, houses in pits, and then also above ground structures. And you can see in this diagram here how he divided up what he called the Viejo period. And another interesting thing about this time period, the footprint isn't as big as these above ground apartment buildings and sites that were built during the Medio period. And so while the period lasted probably 2 to 3 times as long as the Medio period, again, the footprint is a lot smaller. You can't see much of what was there because when people built these pit houses or these pit structures and the houses were abandoned and they would collapse, it kind of makes a flat surface, right? So the only thing that indicates to us today where a lot of these sites are 3 things. Number one, types of artifacts on the ground surface. So if we find any red on brown ceramics, that often indicates that this is from the Viejo period, or that there might be buried architecture underneath. The second thing is there have been a lot of sites under Medio period sites, a lot of Viejo period sites, suggesting some continuity, if not a lot of continuity from the Viejo to Medio period. In other words, people converting their construction style from these like in-ground pits in which they built their houses out of to above ground architecture. And in most of the modern excavations that have been done in Medio period sites, we often find Viejo period context right beneath that. And I'll give an example of that later at the site of Paquime. And the third thing, another way to find Viejo period sites is looting. And unfortunately, the majority of sites in Mexico that I've run into have been looted. Those have not usually are protected on private land or just really well hidden somewhere. But unfortunately, that is a reality working in this area and in most areas where archaeology is accessible by the public. So here's the site of Paquime. This is an aerial view looking north. And it's pretty well straight north. This is an impressive site. And again, it's attracted archaeologists for years because of it's not only monumental architecture, but it's very, very awkward architecture for this area. Adobe is not uncommon in the rest of the Southwest as a building material, and pit structures aren't either, but these large adobe complexes, apartment complexes that were found at Paquime were just out of the ordinary, with it being suggested at least being 3 stories tall. You can see this apartment complex here in the southern portion of the site, only partially excavated, yielded some of these multi-storied apartment buildings. You can see to the east parts of the site that haven't been dug. There are some estimates that suggest that only 1/5 of this site has been excavated. But the parts that have really attracted and have really kind of brought this site to fame are what we consider to be the ceremonial or more public aspects of this site, such as this mound known as the Mound of the Birds. So these platform mounds they're not common, especially in these kind of odd shapes at this site in particular. There's also a Mound of the Cross, which is a cardinally aligned, just about 1 meter high, so about 3 feet high cross with, you can see on each end, these circular platforms with stairs that go up to the platforms, suggesting some kind of ceremonial activity that might have happened there. I have a paper coming out actually at the end of this year in a book that suggests that this was, and as other people have suggested in the past, that this was a solar observatory. But the cool thing is that we see this north, south, east, west cardinal alignments at other sites all throughout the valley during this time period. We also have eye-shaped ball courts. This is one here to the north that's been fully excavated. There's another one to the south that was cut through by an arroyo. And this ball game is known all throughout Mesoamerica, throughout times as well. So this is one of the latest ball courts that we find, but definitely the furthest north of the shape. And this ball game, as you may know, many of you who are familiar with the Maya, the Aztec and many others who played the ball game, is played with a big rubber ball and often hit with hips into circular rings. We're not exactly sure how the game was played, but these eye-shaped ball courts are indicative of the game being played at this site. And again, the farthest north you'll find these. So there's these influences, number one, from not only the south, but the architecture also suggests influences from the north. For example, T-shaped doorways and windows are something that we find in places like, for example, the Four Corners region of the United States, including Northwest New Mexico, Chaco region, and Chacoan sites, as well as Mesa Verde and other Mesa Verdean sites. So it's really neat to see this, like, it's kind of been, it was a melting pot after about 1200 AD. But the big question is, what in the world was here before? So here's an aerial photo of the site. And here's a map that we created from the drone footage, or the drone photos that we took in this picture. So once again, you can see all this monumental architecture. One other thing I forgot to mention, and I think this is very important because this is a desert region and a desert site, water was very important. And so they actually built reservoirs. You can see two here. We've estimated that these reservoirs could hold enough water to definitely to provide water for the people in the site itself. And which population estimates at the site itself vary anywhere between 2,500 people and up to 5,000, which was originally estimated. You know, I probably fall on the lower end, but who knows? There's a lot of the site that hasn't been excavated. And so these population estimates are oftentimes made based on sizes of rooms and the number of people who could fit them. But we know people kind of lived all over the place, worked all outside, you know, a lot. So not exactly sure, but I think 2,500 is easily a good guess. And this water, these water reservoirs could have easily provided enough water for these people. So again, this massive city, I think in the past, it's been characterized as kind of like popping up. But the interesting thing is before this time period, at least for 500 years, people were living in these well-watered valleys. Many of them in the same places that they were building the Medio period sites, near water, oftentimes on river terraces, right above floodplains on these well-watered valleys, likely because that's where they were growing corn. So corn agriculture was present all throughout the 500 years from about 650 to 1200 AD. But very, very little was known. As a matter of fact, at the Amerind, I was invited back in 2012 as a junior scholar, along with a lot of senior scholars, and which turned into this book, Ancient Paquime in the Casas Grandes World. We sat together as a group of scholars who've worked in this region and tried to synthesize what had happened. And reading each other's work and talking about this, we also devised and put together a list of what needs to be done from here on out. I don't know, sometimes I feel like it may have been a lecture to me and the other junior scholars that were there. But it not only struck a chord, but it really did sink in with two of us, me and my colleague, Dr. Todd Peitzel. And he and I decided in around 2011, 2012 to start our own project, looking at the Viejo period, the old period. So we started by doing pedestrian surveys. And for those who are not familiar, pedestrian surveys, simply walking in a line. I've had non-archaeologists mention it looks like a manhunt, right? When you're searching for a body, unfortunately. You get in a line and you walk these transects. And so we focused our attention on these areas in which we knew that sites had been found. We've even talked to looters and of course, locals have a lot of knowledge about these areas. And we did just that by trying to identify some sites. So in conjunction with reconnaissance, in other words, going out and talking to people, finding sites like that, we also did pedestrian survey. Here we are, one of the sites, actually flagging where we find artifacts to try to identify the parameters of the site or the regions around about. And in these surveys, it resulted in at least 5 new unregistered, and I say new, the local people, a lot of them already knew about these sites, right? But 2 archaeologists, and especially those who archived this information and this data in the central location at the National Institute of Anthropology and History in Chihuahua City. These were 5 new sites that hadn't been recorded. And these are right along the Palanganas River. And it's a really well-watered valley just south of the Paquime Casas Grandes River Valley, excuse me. So these sites are about, I would say, 4 to 5 miles away from Casas Grandes itself, right? But once again, right off the edge of the river, one is actually right on the river itself and close to the town of Mata Ortiz. And many of you might know that site or that town is a small potting community or ceramic community that has come to fame in many parts of, I know in the Americas, if not in the world, for the really fine pottery that is, many of the designs are based on the pottery that was made during the Medio period. So again, these are the sites that we found, and we decided to go back and visit 2 of these to excavate them after our surveys. So Vista del Valle, which is on the eastern side of the river, and San Diego sites. These had the most promise we felt for yielding the most information about the Viejo period. So back in 2015, we excavated the Vista del Valle site, which in Spanish means view of the valley. And it's a really beautiful site just at the base of some mountains to the east. And then in this river plain, if you look across the valley, you can see the Grand Sierra Madre Occidental, which is a mountain range that runs much of the portion of western Mexico from the international border all the way down before you get down into the plains that go into hit the coast of western Mexico. But this is again an interesting site. People knew about this site. It became famous amongst local looters because of all of the Mimbres pottery. Mimbres pottery is found in southwest New Mexico and has these beautiful black on white figurative designs, especially the later kinds of pottery that was found there. And we know that there was trade in that time period in which this pottery was made. And it was suggested or told, the myth was that looters found one burial that had, I think, 5 or 6 vessels in it. Unfortunately, Mimbres pottery has also gained a lot of interest amongst private collectors and sellers, and it has become very valuable. And so a lot of looters found out about this and decided that they wanted a piece of the pie and looted the heck out of the site. I don't know how else to put it. So this is our crew in 2015 digging an initial trench just to see what the damage was like in parts of the site. And we did in fact find that the core of the site was just looted so heavily that the data was just so poor that we were pulling out. So after digging this long trench, which you can see here, TU11, we decided to dig outside of the really heavily looted area, which is circled here in dotted red line. And we were fortunate enough to find some really, really well-preserved Viejo period architecture, although it was in danger of being washed away. Literally inches below the ground, we found the foundations of a couple of pit structures, or what we think may also be surface structures. We feel like that the Viejo period people, probably some of them dug down into the ground to build their houses out, but others actually would place these structures right on the surface. And this was manifested at least one of the structures at this site. This is one, doesn't look like much. It looks like a very shallow hole in the ground, and that's in fact what it was. But we did find remnants of walls, plastered walls here on the edge. You can see some burning here. And we also found several artifacts right there on the floor, suggesting that this was some type of structure that was covered with not only walls, but some kind of roof. Right here, you can see a grinding stone, or what we call a metate, and a mano right next to it, as well as a mocojete, which is a stone bowl, mortar and pestle, we think, or maybe just a small grinding bowl that another rock was used inside. We have another grinding stone here, and it was very small. Perhaps only 2 to 3 meters in diameter. It was oval in shape, and let me show you a map that resulted from that, which is not uncommon to the Viejo period architecture that was found earlier by Charles de Peso when he originally excavated in this valley from 1958 to about 1961. And again, they don't look like much, and they really aren't. The margins, as you can see, these dotted lines were really hard to identify. But we found enough to try to get more information out of it. Not only that, but some good radiocarbon dates as well. We also find bits of jacal, which is like adobe or mud that's been pressed into, or at least they indicate adobe and mud pressed into vegetal material. But we didn't find very much of it, which is important because de Peso originally thought that these were kind of like igloo structures with like adobe all over the top of them. But we didn't find enough adobe on the floor to suggest that. So we were kind of changing our idea how these structures were actually roofed. Here's another one that we found, and again, not much to look at, but these post holes did indicate that kind of the perimeter of this structure. This one in particular was really difficult to figure out because out here we thought this was the floor. In fact, it was an exterior use surface, and it was really dark, covered in artifacts, but then it stopped at the same level as the floor of the pit structure. Again, what we thought was a pit structure, but appeared to be a surface structure. So, you know, we're finding more variability than de Peso suggested back in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s when he wrote up his report from his 3-year excavation. And this is, again, kind of a drawing of what that structure turned out to look like. Our original test excavations found like this wonderfully preserved, what I think was wall. Again, so they would put posts in the ground. So you can see these post holes around. Then they would put either some kind of vegetal material. So it could have been reeds or perhaps mesquite wood or grasses. And then they would press mud around it, and then that would dry eventually and make their walls. Here's a great example of a grass or reed impression of adobe. This house, it appears burned, and so it preserved the impressions of the sticks and stuff that were impressed in that mud when it burned, and burned out all the sticks, right? But then what you have left is an impression in the adobe itself. So that's indicated to us that there was a structure there. And so, after digging several of these sites, I decided to team up with an artist. And this artist, she's a illustration major and an archaeology minor, and just graduated yesterday. So excited for Alyssa. I brought her on, and we started to show her a bunch of the maps and some of the original renditions of what we thought these things look like. We also took her to the field last year so she could see the vegetation, so she could see what these excavated structures look like after the fact. And this is, again, a diorama, a rendition of what it looks like. It's actually right behind me here on my shelf. You can see back there. My light just turned on for me. And again, we do find these structures that are pit structures, so dug into the ground a little bit, likely built up out with some very, very short walls. But then we think what was built on top were probably a thatch-like roof. It's a very hot desert, as anybody who's been down there, or anybody who's near Dragoon, it's very similar to the weather that's down there. Maggie mentioned to me that it's probably going to be in the 90s today. So we imagine that there were probably some spaces between the roof and the walls, and that would probably help with airflow and things like that. But also in the winter, when it got colder, being partially underground would also help retain any heat that was generated by a fire. And we suspect that there was some kind of hole at the top to allow the smoke to escape. Of course, with thatch roofing, it could more easily escape through the thatching. So again, we excavated the site of Vista del Valle, started to find and understand a little bit more about the architecture, and then returned we were hoping to return in 2019 and 2020, but with the pandemic, we were only able to go back in 2019 to the San Diego site. Fortunately, we were able to get back last year. Here's the site of San Diego. We called it the San Diego site because of the Hacienda San Diego, which is a very famous, at least in this region, early or historic period hacienda. So it was a plantation. Diego Terrazas is known as a very influential man in northern Mexico. They once asked where he was from in Chihuahua, and he answered, "Yo soy Chihuahua." He said, "I am Chihuahua." He apparently owned much land in Chihuahua before the Mexican Revolution. This was one of his plantations where he had a ranch and farming facilities all along the Palanganas River. And across from the Hacienda San Diego, here's the Palanganas River and the floodplain. You can see they're still farming it today. The majority of what's being grown is pecans, some alfalfa, and other grains for feed for animals. But here, right on the eastern terrace, was the San Diego site. And this piqued our interest, not only since our survey, but we had visited the site off and on since we had identified it in 2013 and said, this would be a really good site to dig. So we went in 2019. And again, this is the view. You can see the pecan. We're looking north here, the pecan fields down off the terrace. And here's a view just from up above the terrace. Here's a map of the site itself. Once again, unfortunately, a lot of looting in this area, especially in this northern area and this southeastern area. Interestingly, as much as we hate looters, and I don't use that word lightly, but as much as we as archaeologists dislike and hate looters, they can also help us, right? So we decided actually to go to one of these areas because if a looter's dug there, they've likely found something, right? So we even actually went into one looter's trench to start exploring just a little bit to see, in fact, what it was the looters were after. And here is a picture of that trench. You can see here, this is our initial trench at the San Diego site when we first got there in 2019. And as we excavated and we put in our units, we identified this floor. You can see this kind of grayish brown it's a modeled floor, right? It's one of the, believe it or not, one of the best preserved floors I've ever excavated from the Viejo period. And it was about 3 centimeters thick. So this was plaster that was put down probably in layers over time, walked on, and then of course it gets really dark, not only from people walking on it, but it appears that this structure was burned. And what's really cool about this structure is it turned out to be what we consider to be a communal structure. That's just a word to suggest that, you know, it wasn't just one family living here, but perhaps a place where families at this site gathered. And up to this point, only 4 had been found. So this is the 5th. And as according to my measurements, and of course, we're always trying to, you know, be the biggest, the earliest, the latest, the greatest. It is the largest Viejo period communal structure that's been found, about 9.6 meters in diameter. You can see again from this aerial shot, we used a drone to photograph this. You can see that kind of dark grayish indication of where the floor was. But then we had preserved walls on this southwestern edge and also on the northeastern edge. Not only indicating, much like the habitation structures that were built, but that these probably had shorter walls and probably thatched roofs as well. We also found a hearth in the middle, and 4 post holes well, we actually excavated 3 of them, but we believe a 4th one to be here that probably held up the roof of this structure. Here you can see Scott, my colleague Scott Ure, who right now is collaborating with me in Northwest Mexico. And that's me in the background. You see us in our socks because when you walk on these floors, they can be very fragile. And so we made a rule, no shoes on the floor of these pit structures. And here Scott is actually mapping it. He recently made a 3D rendition that I think is it's just very close to what we think looked like the actual site or the structure itself. And through the mapping, we were able to find various things that were indicative of how these things were built and what was found in them. You can see some burned beams that we found that were indicative of the roof structure after it burned and collapsed. Here's one as we were excavating it. We also found the post holes, nothing left in them, likely because either the posts had burned and corroded, but of course, over approximately 1,300 years, they probably just decayed over time. We also found a hearth. Here it is, clay-lined or plaster-lined hearth, beautifully preserved. And the only really thing that we found on the structure floor was a vessel, a pot. And I'll talk about that here in just a little bit. So it appears that the structure was not only burned, but was cleaned out before it was burned. Ritual burning is something that we see everywhere from this far south in the U.S. Southwest and Northwest Mexico, all the way up to another place that I study, which are the Fremont and the Fremont people here in Utah. As a matter of fact, we're starting an excavation next week at the Hinckley Mound site here in Utah Valley. It's about 15 minutes from campus. Very convenient. I get to sleep in my own bed and shower at my own house every night. The best kind of digging. But these ritual burnings appear to have happened all across the Southwest, may have been a pan-Southwest tradition as people abandoned structures to ritually close them by burning them. It appears that this may have happened at this structure because there was nothing in it, literally nothing in it except one pot that had probably fallen either from the roof where it was hanging or was on the floor when the roof collapsed. And the rest of it was just filled with dirt after it had collapsed and had washed in with erosion. But again, all of these little clues give us some indication of how this thing was built. Once again, we believe jacal. So again, also known as bajareque, which is a Spanish word for walls that are built with posts and other kind of plant material in between adobe that was pressed on each side of it. We know that this adobe construction method was used because we also found indentations and prints in adobe that was burned. But again, not that much adobe. So these kind of dome structures that DePeso thought of, we're kind of redefining what he thought. Of course, this communal structure was much larger, so the roof was probably made of vegetation. Again, we've got these reeds and pieces of grass, small sticks that the adobe was impressed in. We even found pieces of adobe with fingerprints and handprints, indicating that these were pressed in by hand, which again, to many of us that were working out there, it was so fun to find that connection, right? We're digging these houses We didn't find any burials at this site, but here's this connection to the actual people who built the site. And these small things to us can be very exciting. Once again, my colleagues, this is Dr. Todd Peitzel analyzing the pot that we found. The only vessel and or thing that was found in the base or on the floor of this communal structure. And it was what we call a anchando vessel. So it's a really broad line painted vessel. You can see the red lines right here on this portion. We were able to reconstruct the majority of it. For some reason, it was the only thing there on the floor of this house. So perhaps it was deposited maybe ritually or just part of a tradition that they would do when they finished using a home. And again, very, very beautiful example of a Viejo period pottery. The painted pottery was just this kind of like red on tan or red on buff color, similar to other places at this time period, not only in the US Southwest, but also in parts of Western Mexico. And here's the rendition. Again, only 4 other communal structures from the Viejo period have been identified. This is a rendition of another communal structure. This is the one of 2 that Charles de Peso excavated at the site of Convento, which is very far north I say very far, about 10 miles north of where we were excavating. But again, along a very well-watered valley, up on a river terrace, but indicative of a structure that was probably built by a community and surrounded by smaller pit structures, smaller houses. So we're thinking this is probably the pattern of these small hamlets, a central structure, some kind of structure where people could gather, and then houses that were built around that, these like 3 to 4 meter wide diameter houses. De Peso actually also found evidence of these central posts. He actually found 6 in this one. This house diameter was somewhere around 9 meters in diameter. For scale, you can see a person. This isn't a great photo, but you can see a person sitting here inside the structure. So you could imagine anywhere from 20 to 30 people being able to fit into one of these structures. Perhaps people from other communities were coming to gather for feasts or for some kind of ceremony, or perhaps just to get together, right? And so this is a great rendition of that. And I don't think I have the rendition that Scott made of the 3D structure, but we'll save that for another lecture. And these are my students from last year. So I wanted to kind of transition to some of the stuff we did last year in 2022. This is Sam Jensen, who actually will be going to the University of Oklahoma to start his PhD, just graduated yesterday. And Emily, she is Emily Brown, who's at the London College, University College of London, where she's studying archaeology, doing a master's in archaeology. And they're excavating one of these small pit houses that we found just to the west of the communal structure. Again, we have so little information about the Viejo period that every little bit that we pull out of the ground gives us a little bit more information about how these people lived. And they, in fact, found this structure. Sam was kind of running the crew there. Scott Ure was able to create a 3D rendition of structure, what we call structure 2, which is, again, not much to look at, but to us, every little bit of data tells us something about how these people not only built their houses, but how they lived. Here, once again, you can see the post holes that are indicative of those walls of these structures. And you can also see other various things inside. And I have some little labels here to show you. So there were subfloor pits where they may have stored food or other items, maybe capped them with a pot or something to hide them underground, or at least to keep them safe. We also found a hearth. Once again, it was plaster lined. You can see it's very well defined by the plaster around it and well preserved because of the heat that was probably generated when fires were burned there. You could also see portions of plaster floor just in this eastern side of the structure. And then, of course, the post holes that indicate not only the edge of the structure, but where the wall was probably built up to meet the roof. So this is a structure, one of the structures that the artist was introduced to and shown, and she was able to, again, create a rendition based off that. So not only did she build some models, but she also made this beautiful rendition of what we think a Viejo period pit structure would have looked like. Again, we're kind of, my master's student, Sam Jensen, who again is going on to the University of Oklahoma, his whole master's thesis was, was there continuity amongst these structures? Were they all pit structures? Was there a transition? We're finding there was just variability depending on where you go in the Casas Grandes region, as we see in homes today, right? You've got general architectural kind of themes, right? Victorian, or a Tudor, or even a shack, right? But the themes in modern construction today are rectangular for the most part, right? But for the Casas Grandes people, it was circular and using wood and mud to make their houses. But what we do find, or I should say what we don't find, is a lot of adobe on the floors of these structures when we're excavating. Which in regions of the Southwest, other parts of the Southwest and Northwest Mexico, where they did have adobe or mud all over their structures, you find a nice thick layer, like up here in the Fremont region, of this mud. Didn't find that at all with the Viejo period structures. You find kind of deposits, especially around the edges of the houses, suggesting that the walls were probably shorter and collapsed. But we do find a lot of vegetation or evidence of where vegetation would have been at the origin of the roof and the wall itself, suggesting that there were probably thatched roofs. Once again, allowing for the smoke to escape from these fires that they had inside. We imagine there was some kind of small opening, perhaps a step down into anywhere from like 3 inches to about 30 centimeters. There I am switching, sorry. 3 inches to, I'd say, about, a foot underground or more, where they dug down and built their houses out. Other ones were right on the surface. So again, I think this is a really good rendition. It's to scale, so you can see there's not much room inside. So we assume too that a lot of work was done outside of the house, and maybe that indoors was used just to get out of the elements, to cook, and perhaps even to just sleep. But she did an awesome job on this. Just beautiful kind of cross section of what these houses may have looked like based on the archaeology and the stuff that we found. We also found this really neat historic structure, and it was just kind of happenstance that it happened to be there, maybe associated with the Hacienda San Diego. We found a small metal plate on the floor and also a pot sitting right on top of a stove. It was a stove made of stone and adobe. So we have yet to get to try to date this, but we'll be sending those radiocarbon dates out pretty soon. And again, just to kind of conclude what we know about the San Diego and Vista de Valle site, they're pretty early compared to the Gavento site, but they span the time period that we know to be the Casas Grandes Viejo period. Anywhere from about 650 AD, you can see with these earlier dates down here at the Vista de Valle site, all the way up to 1200. Radiocarbon dates are indicating to us that this is pretty solid. We did have a really aberrant date from this is a piece of research that I'm doing with Meredith Snow at the University of Montana. Dr. Snow and I are doing a larger DNA study comparing the Viejo period, Medio period. Interestingly, just to give you a little tidbit before the article comes out, we for sure seen continuity in the gene pool from one to the other. So these suggestions that there were large migrations from other areas that built Paquime is probably not true. We're feeling more like there was definitely continuity in the gene pool, but some in-migration that may have had some effect on how people lived after about 1200 AD. Artifacts that we find are pretty common. Grinding stones like we find throughout the Americas at this time period, especially amongst those people who are corn farmers. Arrowheads suggesting and dart points suggesting hunting with both bows and arrows, larger dart points, probably atlatl spears as well. Again, here's some of the painted pottery that we found, red on buff or red on brown. Some beautiful examples of what we don't know what they were used for. Perhaps these were the beginnings of spindle whorls used to actually spin thread from different things, perhaps cotton or other fibers. But one of the things that really stood out to us and verified by Dr. Patricia Gilman, who works in the members area, this is a members sherd. So again, there was trade between these areas, what we know as southern New Mexico and northern Chihuahua. Again, no international border existed back then, but we have evidence of the trade amongst these regions. This was a really neat black, probably made of jet or ignimbrite pendant. This shape is not uncommon to other parts of Northwest Mexico and the greater Southwest. And then one of our most exciting finds is in that communal structure, we found a remnant post. We actually sent that post to the tree ring lab at the University of Arizona. Unfortunately, the outer rings were missing, so we couldn't get a date from it. But we were able to identify it as some kind of pine, likely ponderosa. And we would say ponderosa because it had to be probably pretty tall and pretty straight to hold up a roof structure that was anywhere between 8 and 10 feet tall. But right underneath that post were found 2 marine shells. deposited right at the bottom, perhaps as an offering. I can't think of any other way that they got down there other than somebody placing these marine shells under the post before it was placed in the ground. And so this is really neat because these marine shell are probably, these are beads, so they were shaped probably from a marine animal known, or the shell known as Olivella. And they were shaped and then a hole that was perforated and probably placed on a necklace. But in this case, they were deposited. Not sure why, but really fascinating. And here's the crew working. We were able to invite a large group of students from the National School of Anthropology and History in Chihuahua City. This is of northern Mexico. And it was just a blast. This is Lorenzo's screening. We got to invite the public. This is the mayor of Casas Grandes right back here. His wife, the cultural director, and we were able to invite a bunch of people out and then even did a public presentation in October to let them know what we're finding. Being one of only 2 archaeologists that are actually digging in this area, this is really exciting to the town because once again, you know, we're coming in and doing some stuff, especially post-pandemic, that gets the folks there excited. These are their ancestors, right? They see them as their antepasados. And so for them, it was really exciting to see new light coming from archaeology, recent archaeology. This is just some of my crew. Wonderful, wonderful students from BYU and other places, Montana and others. We also had a crew of videographers who came. We had a lot of fun. That's me in the face mask at the top. I guess I like just being dirty, but they were cleaning their faces and I put on my wrestling mask. Wonderful students. We even got some press in the newspaper, which was really fun because a lot of people were able, when they see us in town, they knew who we were, and we were able to, you know, do some public education on the fly at times. We also have wonderful collaborators. This is what I call our intergalactic liaison of cultural affairs, also known as Julian Hernandez. He's worked with archaeologists for many, many years, including my mentor, Paul Menace, and my other mentor, Mike Whalen. Here he is teaching students how to make traditional, or make pottery using traditional methods. And he is actually one of the potters from Mata Ortiz, who has just been key in kind of indicating to folks in this area the importance of the archaeology. Tiny, tiny Arrowhead, our wonderful crew. And then finally, if you want to read more about what we've been doing in this area and some of the implications for it, you can always pick up the book. This is my unapologetic plug for my new book with Matthew Pales, Hinterlands to Cities, Archaeology of Northwest Mexico. And it's vecinos meaning neighbors. And if you want to see a little bit of what it was like, you know, they say a picture is worth 1,000 words. Well, moving pictures are 24 frames per second. So I think that's 24,000 words per second. You can check out this little video that BYU put together. I put up here the name of it. You can just search it on YouTube. It's called Ancient Mexican Site Unearthed by BYU Archaeology Team. And it gives more of an kind of the process of what we did and how we found the stuff that we did, but then also some of the stuff we're doing with our students and how our what we call an experiential approach to teaching our students archaeology can really help them gain the skills they need when they go out into the workforce. And it also highlights some of my wonderful, wonderful students, both those here at BYU and those in Mexico. So finally, I just want to thank everybody for being here, but also those in Mexico who are just such wonderful people to collaborate with, especially Julian Hernandez, his girlfriend, and the most amazing cook, Lupita Martinez, and many others, not only at INA, but the Museum of Northern Cultures, as well as the municipal town of Casas Grandes was so gracious to invite us there. Thank you very much.
So Mike, we have a few questions. Would you like to answer them?
Absolutely. And I think we've got about 12 minutes left. Is that right, Maggie?
Yeah.
Yeah, I would love to.
Okay, let me see. Will there be a 2023 field season from Tim?
Yes. As a matter of fact, we are working on that right now. As soon as we get the write-up from 2022 done, we're going to be submitting a permit for flying a drone with a LiDAR sensor mounted on it. We just got this. We're dying to fly. Many of you may know that LiDAR is kind of revolutionizing, especially sites that are covered by jungle and other forest canopies or vegetation. And we're not only wanting to fly at Paquime itself to see if we can identify any structures outside of the city center that may be great places to go and excavate, but also there's another site that's been known for a long time. Actually, Robert Leonard excavated it back, I think, in the previous century, but It's known as the Galiana site. Nabacoyana is another word that the local people used. And it's a site that some would say is as large as Paquime. Having gone there last year and done some really brief kind of reconnaissance on the site itself, it may be a little bit smaller, but it was definitely some kind of sister site to Casas Grandes, very large. So we want to fly that one as well with a drone. My former student, Sam Jensen, is looking at actually that site as a place where he can work for his dissertation research. And so we're going to start flying our LiDAR to see if we can identify the perimeters of the structures itself. We definitely have evidence there, 2-story apartment buildings, maybe a ball court, or at least a plaza, but just as rich in artifacts as we found elsewhere at Paquime and other sites roundabout. So that's the plan so far.
Thanks. And one from Brian, DNA analysis from what material?
So we have, in collaboration with the National Institute of Anthropology and History, which is the governing body over all cultural patrimony in Mexico. We got permission back in 2018, to do analysis on human remains that came not only from the site of Paquime, but also from the Convento site. And these are 2 sites that were excavated back in, like I said, by Charles DePeso, who, by the way, I should mention, was funded and supported by the Amarin Foundation for this 3-year-long excavation, which is totally unheard of nowadays. People don't dig for 3 years straight, but he did. And he exhumed over 500 burials from these 2 locations. And so these were in the museum, Museo de las Culturas del Norte, in storage there. And so many people have done different types of analysis. We decided to do DNA analysis, not only using materials from teeth, but also from the petrous bone, where it's better well preserved, which is right kind of behind the inner ear. And we were able to get good, well, I should say this, all DNA comes in pieces that's ancient, what we call aDNA or ancient DNA. Just like everything else that's organic, it corrodes and decomposes over time. But there are new methods like next generation sequencing, which can take the pieces of DNA and match them up to at least give us ideas, in the case of mitochondrial DNA, haplogroups and haplotypes. Here we are going back, and let me just state up front, I am not the expert on this. My colleague, Meredith Snow is, and so I kind of leave all the details to her. But as I understand it, the DNA gives us some indication of, again, changes in the gene pool over time, but especially with mitochondrial DNA. Of the 148 samples that actually worked, that we had enough of the DNA sequence strands, we are also sending those samples, or have sent those samples, to the Harvard Reich lab, and we're now doing nuclear DNA, which gives us the ability to look at even deeper at things like genetic disposition for certain things. We can also see familial relationships amongst burials. So let's say we have a burial in this structure and another burial in this structure, and they date to around the same time. We can find out if those people are related based on nuclear DNA. So we have some really neat stuff coming out this year about this most recent research on DNA.
Oh. And one from Monette. Did they move from round pit houses to square adobe types? And do you know when and why?
Yes, so that is definite. We know that there was a transition. A lot of people in the greater Southwest call this, the pit house to Pueblo, pit house to Pueblo transition, where they not only started converting from these like circular pit houses to square ones. We see that the time period is sometime between about 1100 and 1200 AD. We think we need a lot more information. We need a lot more data that comes from that transition period. And a lot of what we've been doing is looking for these transition sites, right? Where we get the later dates, and then also we find architecture that way. Right now, my next place where I want to excavate is Paquime itself. DePeso found 7 circular pit structures underneath what's known as Unit 6, which that Unit 6 is all rectangular, above ground, square, rectangular buildings. So I guess why they did that, I don't know if I can answer that, but it is part of a larger and a much broader trend across the greater Southwest. It happened to have occurred much later in the chronology. Like 1100, 1200 is kind of late to see that transition. compared to other places like Chaco Canyon or the Greater Chacoan places, or I guess Hohokam, for a large portion of their pit house living, they were, kind of these sub-rectangular pits. But again, there were these transitions in time, and I'm not sure why. Maybe it's because they were moving from place to place, seeing other people do this, and maybe in fact decided to copy it. But maybe it was just a preference. Not exactly sure, but more or less that's when we see that transition in the area.
Okay. And another one, that mound of the cross, is that considered similar to the cross and circle design found at Teotihuacan?
You know what? I would not be surprised, right? So one of the things that we find at Paquime, at Casas Grandes itself, is a lot of trade wares. I say trade wares, trade goods. In particular, the two that we hear about the most that come from further south, where they were probably, I guess, interacting with people from that region, are scarlet macaws and copper bells. We do find marine shell. A lot of that probably came from further west. But these things are indications that they were interacting with people from the south. Now, Teotihuacan was probably, at least for Paquime itself in the Mound of the Cross, probably was around 600 to 400 years earlier than Paquime. So it's really important to look at the chronological sequence of things. But the cross shape is not uncommon, uncommonly found on pottery and in architecture and things like that, all the way up north. I've seen a ceremonial structure that at an Aztlan site in Western Mexico, thought to be contemporaneous with Paquime, that had this circular ceremonial structure with these little crosses built into the masonry of the site itself. So I guess I should say, much like corn farming and adobe architecture in the greater Southwest, ball games in Mesoamerica, these things kind of bled together into what we know as Paquime area. And I will say also that that there's a good chance, right, that these crosses were symbolic of something at Teotihuacan, and at one point made their way right over the 400 to 600 years after Teotihuacan, and that empire had been abandoned and or collapsed, and may have moved north with people who were building and using this symbol in other places. But it is really fascinating to look at these connections, even if they're separated by, especially when they're separated by hundreds of miles, but even hundreds of years.
Yeah. Here's one on the copper bells that you mentioned from Monet. I'm highly involved in gathering data on copper bells in the Southwest US and Northwest Mexico for a copper artifact manual. With 3 manuals published based on my copper artifact master database of pre-contact copper artifacts of the Americas. My first question, should I be doing this? I haven't gotten any good feedback from Native American communities.
I mean, if you're doing everything legally, the copper bells themselves, we presume that these were probably on people's regalia, on their clothing, may have been used as ornaments on, like, say, necklaces, or perhaps as earrings. We don't exactly know. We do find them in burials, right? So interestingly, there's, this is a debate amongst many archaeologists, of whether or not you should involve Native American peoples. I totally believe you should, right? I totally believe, well, and foremost because they have oral histories and knowledge that comes from traditions from way back that could help us understand more about these people in the past. The fascinating thing about Mexico is, unlike the United States, and it's, again, fascinating what a border will do, right? People in Mexico consider, and I would say the majority of people in Mexico have indigenous ancestry. So working with the people there who are supportive of these archaeological endeavors are really excited to hear the research and the information that's coming from this, because it's talking about their ancestors. And so, we're always very respectful. We go through, by going through the National Institute of Anthropology and History, we're following all the laws that have been passed that require us to do certain things when it comes to permitting and things like that. So I would say, as long as you're going through legal channels, especially in Mexico, working with people to collect this data, you're just fine. And especially if you're not doing destructive analysis and these artifacts are preserved, I think you're doing your due diligence. Now, again, other people might disagree with me, but for me, nothing is more exciting than to talk to Indigenous groups and get their perspectives, and then of course to always ask them directly, like, is this something that you approve of or not? But yeah, it can be a fine line sometimes. But again, if you're following all the rules and making sure to follow the laws as well and being respectful, you should be just fine. I'm sure, by the way, if you've been doing research on copper bells, you're familiar with Victoria Vargas and her work on copper bells, which was more specific to the trade between Paquime and West Coast Mexico. But yeah, there's a lot of work still to be done on where these bells originate. Another person who's been doing some of this research is Jose Luis Punzo. And if you like, I can get you in touch with him. He's actually been looking at copper smelting in Michoacan. He's a Mexican archaeologist. Dr. Punzo works at the INA office in Morelos in Michoacan, is also a professor at ENAM. Sorry, that was maybe a little more long-winded than you wanted.
That's okay. We ended up getting a lot of questions here, so maybe I'll pass those on to you. And
Oh, absolutely. I'd be more than happy to answer those.
I can feed them back through the emails.
Excellent.
So that's all we have time for. I thank you so much, and I'll let you sign off.
Okay, thank you so much, everybody. And thank you, Maggie and the Amarin,
Thank you.
for this opportunity. Really appreciate it.
You too. Bye.
Bye-bye.
You too. Bye.
Bye-bye.